Welcome to Sola Church Online.
I'm Alan Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers, and together we lead Sola Church, a hybrid church, digital plus micro.
And if you're wondering what is digital church, well, you are here right now with us having digital church. We put a new service up every Sunday at 10 a.m. Pacific time on our Church Online platform.
And then micro church, that's our small groups called life groups that meet during the week. We've got in-person groups and we've got online groups. We'll tell you more about that at the end of the service.
And I think you're going to enjoy the service today. Let's worship.
picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. When I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love. You picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. And when I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love. You picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. Save me so much better your way. And all I did was praise. All I need to do is worship. Lord, I will just bow down. No, I'm just gonna stay still.
This is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. If you're just checking us out today, please don't feel like you have to participate. But if Sola Church is your church home, or these online services have just been a blessing to you, it's super easy to make a one-time tax-deductible donation or even to schedule a recurring gift.
The easiest way is to scan the QR code on your screen. But you can always go to solachurch.life and click the tab at the top that says Give.
Yeah, I just want to thank you guys so much for your generosity. Your giving makes it possible for us to create this digital content, to do our micro church gatherings, to do outreach. So thank you guys.
Let's get into our time of teaching.
So let me just kind of take you back in time. You know, last week we started talking about Bible prophecy in the end times. We're gonna pick up where we left off. It's kind of a cliffhanger last week, but I mean, like how many of you remember back in the 90s and the 2000s, the Left Behind books and movies? Like there was a lot of excitement about that. Those books sold tens of millions of copies, and the movies with Kirk Cameron were super popular. You know, I'm old enough to remember in the 70s, the late great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. Or what about that film that every youth group coast to coast showed their kids, Like a Thief in the Night? Anybody remember that movie? Oh man, it was basically the original Left Behind, except it was much scarier and had a much lower budget. Just saying, just throwing that out there. But last week, we kind of acknowledged that for a lot of us that have grown up in the church and spent a lot of time around these kinds of conversations, there's a degree of rapture anxiety. You know, Miranda tells a story about finding an empty house once and thinking she'd missed the rapture. A lot of us had that experience, or maybe you dreamed about being left behind. But not only is rapture anxiety a thing, so is rapture fatigue. You know, because again, if you spent decades of your life on the edge of your seat, waiting for Jesus to come for the church at any moment, there's a fatigue that can come from that. And That's understandable. I've experienced that myself, but of course the danger is that we can lose interest in something that's actually quite important. And so it's good that we're talking about it. Before Jesus told us what to think about the future, he told us how to live in the present. So let's open the Bible to Mark chapter 13, the gospel according to San Marcos, or Saint Mark, our city's namesake, being the author. Jesus has marked us. That's why we've called this series Marked. He's marked us not just for ourselves, but so that we can leave his mark in our community and in our country and in our world. Together in this series, we're becoming unstoppable, unerasable, marked. And so last week and this week, we're both calling both of them marked by readiness. Last week, the emphasis was on being faithful. This week, the emphasis is on being watchful. I want to start by jumping ahead in the text. Like we got all the way through 13 verses. We're going to pick up in verse 14 soon. But real quick, look with me all the way ahead at verse 28. Jesus said, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." This is what we call the parable of the fig tree. I want you to get an image in your mind. I want you to picture cases of tape and scores of footballs. I want you to picture 5-gallon bottles of water and shorts and shoes by the hundreds. I want you to picture t-shirts and wide-mouth bottles of Gatorade by the thousands. I want you to picture two-a-days and scrimmage. What am I describing? NFL training camps, baby. Yeah, that's about 1 month away. Do we have any Chargers fans here today? I mean, to me, they'll always be San Diego. You can move them to LA, but to me, they'll always be the San Diego Chargers. Any Rams fans? Come on now, show your pastor some love, because I'm all about the Los Angeles Rams. Lifelong Rams fan. Well, you know, when you see these things happening, when you see all the stuff being unloaded that I just described, when you see the Texans, or I'm sorry, not the Texans, but when you see the Chargers, I used to pastor in Austin, when you see the Chargers reporting to training camp, when you see the Rams reporting to training camp, know that the regular season is near. Woo-hoo! Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. NFL football will be back. And like Jesus is saying, when you see these things, not just the things he's been talking about in the first 13 verses, but the things he'll begin talking about in verse 14, when you see these things, know that the second coming, is near. Now, I want to do something we did last week. I want to revisit the timeline. And I want to say, like I did a week ago, that we can disagree about these things and be friends. Christians have all kinds of different ideas about the sequence of events, and that's okay. I'm going to share with you my perspective. I'm not even saying that I'm right or that anybody else is wrong. I'm just sharing with you where I'm coming from, and it's necessary because I'll reference things on this timeline during the message. So it kind of helps for you to have some idea where they would be placed, right? So let's just say that right here, let's say this is the second coming of Christ. This is when Jesus comes back to earth. So the way I understand the scriptures leading up to that is this 7-year period, just going to walk it back to the start of that 7-year period. The 7-year period that we often refer to, just generally, we refer to the whole 7 years as the tribulation. And then sometime, just before that 7-year period begins, we have an event called the rapture of the church. So Jesus comes for the church. Then you have this period of judgment on the earth, among many things that are happening during that time. Then you have the second coming of Christ. Now going the other way in the timeline, after the second coming, you have the kingdom age. We call it the millennium because Revelation suggests that it lasts for 1,000 years. But you have the kingdom age, which is prophesied throughout the Old Testament. And so Jesus ruling and reigning from Jerusalem. And then at the end of that 1,000 years, you have the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. You have eternity future. That timeline, from a theological perspective and eschatological perspective, would be considered premillennial, pre-tribulational, if you want to go that deep with it. But hopefully that timeline gives you some kind of an idea. Excuse me. So the idea then, Jesus, in talking about how if you see these things, then the second coming, is near. Well, if we were to conclude after reading Jesus' words that the second coming is near, how much nearer is the rapture? At least 7 years, right? If I'm right about the timeline. So what to do? Last week, in talking about being faithful, we talked about what not to do. This week, in talking about being watchful, we get to talk about what to do. And the first thing that Jesus tells us to do is to be aware. Do be aware. So let's go back where we left off last week, verse 14. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Interesting little parenthetical thing there. Let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down into the house, nor enter to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to them who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter, for in those days there will be tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the creation which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, he is there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. But take heed, see, I have told you all things beforehand. So remember that we describe the signs in verses 1 through 13 as being general signs. Things that are always happening. Things that will always be true. The biggest point Jesus was making about those things was not to panic when they happen. Because they're normal. They're a normal part of, life on this planet. But he did suggest that when we see them increasing in frequency and severity, that might indicate that we're getting closer to the end. So that's the general signs. But now starting in verse 14, we get some incredibly specific signs. These are not things that would be happening throughout the age and that might only increase in frequency and intensity at the end. These are things that they're going to happen like a one-time event, is what we're reading about beginning in verse 14, is a one-time thing that's very distinguishable, very discernible. So remember I said that we usually call this whole 7-year period the tribulation. That's just real loosely speaking. Very specifically, when we say the great tribulation, it's a technical term for the second half, for the last 3.5 years. You could break the 7 years in two. You got the first 3.5 years, you got the second 3.5 years. The second 3.5 years, technically the great tribulation, as opposed to just the tribulation. And there is this pivotal event. There's this thing that happens right in the middle of the 7 years, at the 3.5 year mark. This thing that happens, that it's the pivot, it's the hinge of the whole thing. That's when we go from the first half to the second half. So we want to learn about that thing. It's called here the abomination of desolation. Admit it, you're scared just hearing me read it. Like, that is the scariest title ever. I think it would make a great name for a death metal band. If some of you have a garage band right now, you're looking for a name, Abomination of Desolation. I'm just throwing that out there for your consideration. But the idea is that the temple in Jerusalem will be desecrated. This event is spoken of at least 3 times in Daniel, and it was foreshadowed by the actions of Antiochus IV, who desecrated the temple in 167 BC. But according to Jesus, there is a fulfillment of that is still future. But that raises a problem, right? Herod's temple was destroyed in 70 AD, like 40 years after Jesus had this conversation with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. So how is there going to be a desecration of a temple that doesn't exist? You know, it's interesting that next month, actually a month from tomorrow, like to me it's interesting that we're so close on the calendar. Literally 1 month from tomorrow is Tisha B'Av. You know, it starts at sundown on July 22nd, goes to sundown on July 23rd, but it's this annual commemoration that Jewish people have that they keep. They call it the saddest day in Jewish history because it marks the destruction of both the first and the second temples in Jerusalem. So if you were to go back 100 years, it would be very, very difficult to even imagine that there could ever potentially be a temple once again in Jerusalem. It wasn't until 1948 that there came to be a modern state of Israel. Israel hadn't existed from the first century until the 20th century. There hadn't been any state of Israel. So 1948, they declared their independence. And then in 1967, as part of what is known as the Six-Day War, they regained control of all of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, which is, of course, the holiest site in Judaism, but significantly the third holiest site in Islam. So, you know, today, and even since they captured it in 1967, they've allowed the Muslims to manage the Temple Mount. And on the Temple Mount, as you may know, if you've been there like I have, you've seen these structures that I'm going to refer to. On the Temple Mount, there is the Dome of the Rock Shrine, which was built about the 7th century, and there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was built in the 8th century. So the Dome of the Rock Shrine is what you see in pictures a lot of times that has the gold-colored dome on it. People mistakenly refer to that as a mosque. It's not. It's a shrine. But, you know, on the same Temple Mount is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And as I said already, the whole mount is managed by Muslims. Now, this is the whole problem, right? It's like, how could you rebuild a Jewish temple? I mean, imagine what would happen if you were to raise these structures, if you were to tear these structures down so that you could build a Jewish temple. Imagine the uproar, the conflict, the regional conflict that would immediately erupt. But there's a couple interesting things. I'm going to try to talk about them as quickly as I can. I think it's worth talking about them, but I also know that we've got to keep our eyes on the time because we've got a lot to cover. You know, when you think about the situation there, typically it is understood. Most people think when they see a photo of the Temple Mount and they see the Dome of the Rock, most people think that the Dome of the Rock stands exactly where the Jewish temple stood. And that likely could be called the majority view today. But there are some other theories about this. Physicist Asher Kaufman has done some interesting work. He's a retired Hebrew University professor, and he came across some ancient writings that talked about how if you were on the Mount of Olives and looking at the Temple Mount through the eastern gate, you could see directly where the Holy of Holies would have been. So, you know, using measurements from the highest point on the Mount of Olives, looking through the eastern gate, and then pinpointing where that would land on the Temple Mount actually comes up in a different spot than where the Dome of the Rock stands today. It's closer to a smaller shrine called the Dome of the Spirits or the Dome of the Tablets. It's alternately known by those two names. And if the temple were rebuilt there, then that would actually place the Muslim structure in the outer court, which compare Revelation 11, 1 and 2 later, that describes just such a scenario. That's one possibility, is that you could actually build the temple on that site without destroying the other structures. But then there is also what is known as the southern hypothesis, and this is where using infrared photography, they've actually flown over the site and photographed the site using this infrared technology, studying the subterranean structures and so forth. And in this particular study, they've placed the site of the ancient temple and the Holy of Holies between the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which, as I said, are both on the mount, but they're separated by some distance. So you could put the temple between those, and in that case, both of those structures would fall into the outer courts. Again, you could compare that to the beginning of Revelation 11, where just such a thing is suggested. So just a couple things, throwing them out there for your consideration. If you're interested and you'd like to know more, you can go to a website called templemount.org, and you can read about those and other things. But, on my many trips to Israel, beginning in the 90s and then throughout the 2000s, when we're in Jerusalem, we always go to this place called the Temple Institute. Temple Institute is such a fascinating place because the whole purpose of that organization is to advocate for, as well as prepare for, a rebuilt Jewish temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And they have already recreated many temple vessels and furnishings. They've researched priestly garments. They've trained men from priestly families and temple rituals. When you visit their location there in Jerusalem, you can actually see some of the things they've created. For example, the headdress and the ephod and so forth that the priest would wear, doing those priestly functions. So pretty fascinating stuff, that there is an appetite for that. There are Jewish people who greatly long for that. Israelis who would love to see that. Not necessarily all of them, but a significant number of them that are very interested in that. Napoleon, none other than Napoleon, who just happened to be passing by a synagogue on Tisha B'Av that we talked about before, the annual commemoration of the destruction of the temple. Napoleon was passing by a synagogue, and he could actually hear people moaning from inside the synagogue as they were grieving the destruction of the temple. And so he made this famous quote about, how a people that can mourn its loss for nearly 2,000 years is a people who will see its temple rebuilt. Interesting quote from Napoleon. Well, this abomination of desolation mentioned in verse 14, later, if you want to, you could read in Revelation 13 where we learn more about this. But here's what we learn from Revelation is actually going to happen on this occasion. There's going to be an image of the Antichrist set up in the temple. So last week we learned that, during the tribulation and before the second coming of Christ, the Antichrist will be the leader of a world government and the object of worship of a world religion. And so he has a sidekick, a cohort called the false prophet. And the false prophet will set up this image of the Antichrist in the temple. And what it says in Revelation is that somehow, I know this is weird, I don't even know exactly how this could be, but somehow that inanimate object is going to become animate. That's kind of creepy. I mean, what is that going to be like? And how could that even happen? I mean, could it be like a demonic thing? Is there some way that a demon could possess an inanimate object and make it seem to become animate? I don't know. What about artificial intelligence? I mean, we are all living in this time where AI is ratcheting up faster than anybody can even keep track of it. I mean, and you hear experts talking about how on the one hand it's this amazing tool and how on the other hand it could be like an extinction event. It's interesting to consider whether AI could play any part in an inanimate object becoming animate. And then let's not leave out the possibility of something like cloning. I mean, if it was possible to make a clone of the Antichrist, and presumably the clone would not have a soul, could that somehow be a part of this? Look, this is pure conjecture. I admit it. I acknowledge it. This is just me thinking out loud. These are the things that go through my head when I read passages like these, and I try to envision how this could be, what this could be like. Those are interesting things to think about and to kick around. But Jesus, is talking about what will definitely be an unmistakable sign. If you were alive on the earth when this event happened, you'd know. You know what I mean? This is an unmistakable sign. This would not be like are there more major earthquakes now than there were 100 years? No, this is like oh my gosh, an inanimate object placed in the rebuilt Jewish temple has just come to life. Like, you're going to know, a person would know, that would be easily recognizable. And so Jesus says when this unmistakable sign happens, then he goes on to give very specific instructions to Jews who would be in and around Jerusalem. And he tells them in verse 14 to flee to the mountains. So maybe it would be helpful for us to just talk a little bit about this thing. Remember I said that we generally refer to this 7-year period as the tribulation. But I also said that sometime just before it begins, Jesus comes for the church in an event that we call the rapture. Technically, this is a common misunderstanding, and it's not super far off, but it's imprecise. Technically, it is not the rapture of the church that starts the 7 years. It's the Antichrist making a peace treaty that involves and includes Israel. And so that could very well have to do with, we referenced it last week, there's a prophecy about a Russian invasion of Israel where they would have allies, including Iran, and God fights on Israel's behalf. It could be that the resolution of that conflict is what creates the opportunity for that peace treaty. But it's that peace treaty that begins the 7-year period. And so again, that treaty, has to do with the nation Israel. So with that in mind, here at the 3.5-year mark, here halfway through the tribulation, the Antichrist breaks the treaty. This person who is not only a political leader, and not even just a religious figure, but an object of worship to the people of the world, goes from being Israel's protector to being Israel's persecutor. So may I just mention that if we want to talk about signs, the troubling rise in anti-Semitism is certainly a sign. The fact that it would be so easy to stomach for the world if Jewish people were to be persecuted is certainly a sign, because that's the kind of thing that's going to happen during the tribulation. Jesus tells them that when this happens, he says to Jewish people that when this thing happens, they should run for their lives. That the threat is so imminent that they don't even dare go back in the house to grab any of their personal belongings, but just get out. Where will they go? Some people have wondered whether they might go to a place in Jordan called Petra. Have you ever heard of Petra? Sometimes it's called the Rock City. In fact, it was famously referred to as the Rose Red City, half as old as time. It's situated there in Jordan, and it's famous for a number of reasons, but especially because of all the stone structures that are carved into the walls. It's like this little valley with steep rock cliffs on either side, and the city is carved into the walls. I've been there. I've seen it with my eyes. It's amazing. When you're standing there and you're looking at all of these buildings carved into, not only do they have caves that go in, but they have beautiful facades. Like, it's unbelievable how architecturally beautiful, aesthetically beautiful the facades are that are carved into the rocks. But so I've been there and I've seen it, and it's interesting because, when it was built, it had waterworks. They had the ability to capture rainwater, to store it, to move it from the point where it was captured to the point where people would access it. It was considered to be mostly impenetrable because the entrance leads steeply through a dark and narrow gorge. Our group, when we toured it, you start on the outside of the gorge. And when you enter the gorge, it is this super narrow gorge, so narrow that there were times walking through this long gorge that I could put out my 2 hands and touch the wall on either side. But you're looking up at this little sliver of daylight because it's so high. I don't even know how many stories high the rock is on either side, but it's just remarkable to look up and see this little sliver of blue. And you're walking and walking and walking and walking until finally you come to the end of that gorge. You step into that little valley where the rock city is, and there right in front of you is what was the ancient treasury. Now, the treasury was decorated with 2 eagles. There's a large eagle on either side of the entrance to this ancient treasury. The heads are gone because, there was a time when Muslim armies were conquering that they were taking the heads off of anything like that. So the heads are gone from these eagles, but you can still see the eagles there. And you've seen this. You may not know you've seen this, but if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, in the closing scene, they actually use they use Petra and they use the facade of the temple. Now, obviously, once they go in, you're seeing a studio. But the exterior shot before they go in, you see the entrance to the treasury and you see the eagles. So like this afternoon when we all get home, Netflix is going to see a surge in streams of what are all those people in San Marcos, California doing watching Indiana Jones on the Last Crusade? Like their meters are going to be spinning, we're going to break the internet. Surely you're curious, right? In Revelation, it talks about something that's sort of worth considering and comparing. It says, when the woman, that is Israel, but the woman, that is Israel, was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time, that's a year, and times, that is 2 more years, and half a time, that is 6 months, or 3.5 years taken altogether, from the presence of the serpent, that is Satan. So is Petra the mountain hideaway? I have no idea. There's no way to know, but it could be. It's interesting, right? So verses 19 and 20, I read them already, but just to sort of revisit them, it talks about how in those days there will be tribulations, such as not been from the beginning of the creation, which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh should be saved, but for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. I mean, if you want to read about that, then read Revelation 16. Where it describes the 7 bowl judgments. The first bowl, malignant sores. The second bowl, the sea turns to blood. Some kind of a red tide effect that would certainly impact the food supply. We would lose tens of millions of tons of food. The third bowl, the fresh waters turn to blood, so that would affect the water supply. There'd be no potable water except for rainwater or treated water. Fourth bowl, men are scorched, some kind of a Nova effect. Like we're talking about, climate change on a level nobody's even thought about having conversations around. When this particular bowl happens, you would truly see the melting of the polar ice caps and the rising of the water levels and the flooding of coastal cities. The fifth bowl, darkness and pain. The sixth bowl, the Euphrates River is dried up, which would give the armies of the world access to Megiddo, which will be sort of a staging area for the Battle of Armageddon, or the final battle. And then in the seventh bowl, the earth is utterly shaken, largest earthquake ever, and hailstones weighing over 100 pounds each. Like I've had hail damage to my car from like marble-sized hail. Can you even imagine? 100-pound hailstones, just crazy. No wonder verse 20 says that unless God put an end to this, like nobody would survive. Now it's talking here about the elect, and that's confusing because sometimes, even in the New Testament, sometimes when it's talking about the elect, it's talking about the church, but other times when it talks about the elect, it's talking about the Jewish people. How do we know which it's talking about in any given New Testament passage? Well, the context tells us. And here the context is Jewish. You notice in verse 14 the reference to Judea. Matthew, in his version of the same text, suggests that it would also be bad if this event were to happen on the Sabbath, when there might be restrictions on travel. So I want to repeat something I said last week, and that is that this passage has nothing to do with the rapture or the church and everything to do with the second coming in Israel. You know what it tells us in Revelation 12, verse 6? It tells us that when the abomination of desolation takes place, the second coming will follow 1,260 days later. So if a person were alive on the earth when the abomination of desolation took place, they could just mark it. 1,260 days later, Jesus would be coming back in the second coming. And so verses 21 to 23 talks about false Christ. We talked about that last week, but now let's read about the second coming. Let's pick it up in verse 24. It says, but in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars of heaven will fall and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man, Jesus, coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Son of Man is a messianic title that goes back to the Old Testament. They'll see him coming in the clouds with great power and glory, and then he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. Comparing what we read in other scriptures, my understanding is that Jesus will actually return first to Basra in modern Jordan. That reference is Isaiah 63, verse 1. One thing that's interesting about that is that Bozrah is geographically in between Megiddo, where the world's armies will be gathered, and Petra, if that was in fact this place where many Jewish people were hunkered down trying to ride this thing out. So almost as if he's putting himself between them and harm. And so then from there he goes north to Megiddo, where the armies of the world turn on him and he destroys them. And then, as described in Zechariah 14, verse 3, he stands on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives splits in two, and he enters Jerusalem through the eastern gate. Man, I mean, are you picturing this with me? How awesome and how incredible this is going to be. Now, the eastern gate has been closed for years. And, it's right there next to the Temple Mount. Like you can look down from the Temple Mount onto the eastern gate. And many years ago, Muslims, knowing that Jesus was prophesied to enter through the eastern gate, deliberately desecrated the ground in front of that gate. They made it a burial place. They buried bodies there. They made it a cemetery so that no Jewish Messiah could ever enter through the eastern gate. Well, I've got news for you. He's coming through the eastern gate. That plan ain't gonna work. But I also want to tell you that I have had a unique vantage point to see the eastern gate. When you were up on the Temple Mount, they actually have, I told you that the Muslims manage the Temple Mount. Christians aren't allowed to pray up on top of the mount. If they know that's what you're doing, they'll stop you. They confiscate your Bible when you go up in the Temple Mount. They'll return it to you when you leave. But I mean, it's pretty strict. And they have an armed guard guarding the back side, the side of the eastern gate that you could access from the Temple Mount is guarded by an armed guard. So me and a member of my staff, when I was pastoring in Austin, it was the day off, and me and him are watching. We're watching the guard, like kind of counting how long does he have, once he passes, how long is his back to the gate? We watched it several times until we had a sense of it. And then at the right moment, right as he passed it, we bolted and we got up behind that gate, kind of walked up onto the structure. We're looking over the gate down. We could see the tombs down below the gate, and we're looking across the Kidron Valley. We're looking at the Mount of Olives. We're imagining Jesus standing in the Mount of Olives and it's splitting in two. I mean, we're having a moment. And then the guard came back and caught us. He did. He like confronted us. And so I just, thinking as quick as I could, I just blurted out the name of the next gate north of that. And then he said, it's that way, like stupid Americans, kind of he understood it like I just had found myself at the wrong gate, had no idea where I was. So we got away with it. I highly recommend it. But be careful, it's on you. If you try it, it's on you. But so we read about this regathering of Israel in verse 27. And then, as I said, the millennium, of course, will follow the second coming of Christ. Verse 31 talks about the heaven and earth passing away. So I said earlier, there'd be a new heaven and a new earth. You can read about that in Revelation 21 and 22. So the parable of the fig tree that we talked about already, Jesus, said, so you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near at the doors. Know, gnosko, the Greek word gnosko, it means to learn to know, to come to know. So we need to be aware. That's the idea of what are we supposed to do? Well, we're supposed to be aware. Like sometimes I think we do need the Bible in one hand and our iPhone in the other, and to have an understanding of what the Bible says about these things, and also an awareness of what is happening in our world. And so that's so important. But there's one other thing we're going to be real brief on it that we're supposed to do, and that is to be awake. The final verses. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Take heed, watch, and pray, for you do not know when the time is. It's like a man going into a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to all, watch. So that word but in verse 32, it's taking us back to the questions that Jesus was answering. Remember at the beginning of the chapter, Jesus had predicted the destruction of the temple. The disciples wanted to know when that would happen. And further, they wanted to know when the second coming would happen and when the end of the age would happen. And so Jesus is basically saying it's on a need-to-know basis and you don't need to know. We're like, I mean, it's like that in life, right? Like the kids need to know. Dads, it's Father's Day. Your kids need to know when it's time to feed the goldfish, right? They don't need to know that that's not the same goldfish they fed 2 weeks ago. They don't need to know that, in fact, 5 different fish have played the role of their goldfish over a period of months. They don't need to know that. Well, what do we need to know? We need to know that he's coming. What we don't need to know is exactly when. Anybody here think they'd never graduate from high school? I thought I would never graduate from high school, and not for the reason that some people think that. I thought for sure the rapture would happen. And it was all because of a misinterpretation of the parable of the fig tree. There was this whole line of thinking that, you know, the fig tree represented the rebirth of Israel. Israel became a nation again in 1948. That'd be the last generation. A biblical generation is 40 years. 48 plus 40 is 88. Peel back 7 years for the tribulation. Rapture's got to happen by May 14th, 1981. And so, I mean, I was a high school student, you know, living in Dallas, Texas at the time. So we were Central Time. And so I even figured it out. Me and my buddies were thinking, it's got to be May 14th. And so then we thought, yeah, but it's not the same time in Dallas that it is in Jerusalem. So we had to figure out the time difference. And so we knew like between what hours. And well, needless to say, rapture didn't happen before I graduated from high school. It's been a hot minute since I graduated from high school. These lines on my forehead give you an idea how long it's been since I graduated from high school. Date setting, there's nothing new about date setting. Anybody remember the book, 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Could Be in 1988? Yeah, if you find a copy of that book, you can pick it up real cheap, just saying. I mean, like it's definitely in the bargain bin. Nobody knows. Jesus didn't even know because of his voluntary non-use of that particular divine attribute. But God the Father knows, and so we're told to watch. 4 times in 5 verses, we're told to watch. We're to be watchful. The Greek verb watch is a compound word. It's a noun that means sleep with a negative prefix. So don't sleep. Don't be caught napping. Don't be caught flat-footed. Keep your powder dry. Stay frosty. That's the idea. Like to me, Mark 13 is spiritual espresso. Yeah, I stopped on my way in honor of this sermon point to get myself a dope-yo. You ready for this? Double shot of espresso. Actually, I couldn't wait. I drank it before church, but there was still a drop. Really good stuff, by the way. But so Mark 13, we should be like spiritually caffeinated. Are you pumped? Like, I mean, none of us are happy that there's going to be some difficult things that are going to happen on the earth. But you know what makes me happy? When I see injustice, it makes me happy to know Jesus is coming back. Can you say that? Jesus is coming back. Yeah, that was really good. Props to Jim. Everybody else should be embarrassed right now. Be a Jim. So 1, 2, 3, Jesus is coming back. So when I see injustice, I'm happy because when I see oppression, I'm happy because yeah, I mean, I just cannot wait to see what it's going to be like when all things are restored. So aware has to do with information, awake with transformation. Aware has to do with input, awake has to do with output. Aware has to do with what I take in, awake has to do with what I give out. We need to wake up. Jesus says we need to wake up and pray in verse 33. We need to pray the prayers. And then in that story that he tells at the end, he suggests we need to wake up and work. We need to work the works. I'm not talking about doing good things to be right with God. I'm talking about as followers of Jesus, seizing the moment, understanding the moment that we're in, and making the most of every opportunity that God gives us. So remember, this will be my last thing and I'll pray, but remember Jesus, when he predicted the destruction of the temple, he told them that not one stone would be left standing upon another. Remember that from last week? You know that was fulfilled. When you go to Israel today, when you go to Jerusalem today, you can go to the Wailing Wall. You can pray at the Wailing Wall, which is an amazing thing to do. But understand, the Wailing Wall was not part of the temple. The Wailing Wall is part of a retaining wall around the Temple Mount. So that doesn't have anything to do with Jesus' prophecy. Not a single stone of the temple was left standing upon another. And you know why? Because again, last week I quoted Josephus, who described the gold plating. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, when they destroyed the temple, they burned the temple, the gold melted and it seeped in between the stones. The huge stones had been hewn out. They fit together something like Legos. And that gold, when it melted, it went down in between those stones. And so afterwards, they dismantled every last stone to get to the gold in it. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that what Jesus predicted about the destruction of Jerusalem in general and the destruction of the temple in particular was fulfilled down to the tiniest detail, just exactly like he said it would be. So too, everything Jesus says about his return will be fulfilled to the tiniest detail, exactly like he said it would be. Are you ready? Will you be found faithful? Will you be found watchful?
And now it's time to fill out a Connect card.
Yeah, just go to our website, solachurch.life, and scroll to the bottom of the homepage, letting us know that you watched today, but also you can request information there about our small groups. And there is actually a lot more information on the website about those. At the top, if you click where it says Gather, you'll find information about all of our groups. An in-person group on Tuesday on the west side, an online group on Wednesday, another in-person group on Thursday on the west side. So check it out, find the time, the date, the location that works best for you, and join us for Sola Micro Church.
And don't forget, go and follow Sola Church on social media.
Yep, at Sola Church LA on all your favorite platforms.
And we hope that everyone has a great week. And we will see you next time at Sola Church Online.
Bye, everybody.